when in 1992, May 9, Shushi went under the control of Armenian armed forces, and Armenians started to resettle back there. As a result of military activities, the city was in ruins, and it had very shaky security. It was misty, cold, rainy, total lack of infrastructure or utilities. It was far from being ideal for residents. It lacked security, it lacked comfort, and its appurtenance was shaky. Anything associated with a home was lacking in a larger scale settlements in particular towns. But only 28 years later, as a consequence of the 2020 44-day war, in the urban narrative of those exiled from Shushi, we still feel the great love that they have amassed in this small town with a big love. Small City Big Love is a Facebook post that characterizes the city by one of the former dwellers of Suti. This is the best attestation there too. Over the years, the Shushi people had acquired the connection to the place. A significant experience was amassed. If we look at the Settle's typology of connection with the locus, one may say that my communication today or the presentation is dedicated to the loss of the place, loss of the location. Of course, economic, ethnological, and religious or sacral connection types with Shushi are not excluded either. The objective of this communication is to demonstrate that the basis of connection to the city was its perception as a home and as a household. In the history of displacement, the lost native land, the exodus, and the idealization of it up to the idyllic heavenly portrayal is typical, and this can be seen also in the narrative of the Shushetsis. But there is also a realistic foundation for this, for the connection to the city. It was its perception as a household, as a family. We did this study right in the wake of the war, shortly thereafter. I started in December 2020 the field work all the way through October. The methodological route was oral histories accompanied by mental mapping. Our respondents were displaced Shushi dwellers who had mostly been put up temporarily in Yerevan. Those were originally former Shushi residents who, from the early onset of the conflict, had to be exiled and then returned, as well as relative newcomers. Predominantly, there were women, and what I portray may be even qualified as a women's take on the city. This particular study focused on the newcomers to the city who, at the onset of the Karabakh city, were resettled, displaced from the Armenian populated areas in Karabakh and resettled in Shushi. This was not a homogeneous group. The interweaving of the cities and their personal stories start with looking for a house in Shushi and settling down, which is very typical for Armenians, creating a hearth, a home. Mostly this was done through the first experience of walking around the city and getting to know it. In the narratives and in the mental maps, one can notice that the city was presented from the vantage point of one's own home, and the road of searching for a home originates there. This is not specific to Shushi. In general, in every description of a settlement, This is characteristic in mental mapping to start with one's home. But in the event of Shushi, the city not only starts with one's home, but it gathers around and is sort of created or built by the pattern of a home, a household, and family. This is a typical quote from one of our dialogues. I want to emphasize that there was a time when my sister's son Vahag used to work in David's retail shop right at this junction. Down there was my brother, a cab driver who was parking his car. When I got out in the morning, my road passed by the taxi stop near Razanchetsov's Cathedral, and this was my sister's apartment building, 5 stories, 4 or 5 stories building, one after the other. In the third, my uncle, my mother, my brother's family all lived in the same building, and the entrances were different. My brother worked at Telecom and was a cab driver for some time. When I was heading to my work every morning, for some reason I recall summer mornings, it was a clear and bright summer morning in some otherworldly way. I was feeling so well that I welcomed, greeted Vahag every day. Then my brother, my sister, I encountered them. I had this feeling that these moments were unique and might one day never repeat. And that's how it worked out. I always felt that things could not have been so well. So in this passage, we see how this woman presents her daily routine, a pathway through the city, which not only completes the city and its mental map, displays the landmarks of the city, such as the Razanchetsov's building, the administration building, the famous junction in Shushi, the buildings that were at the junction. She brings together her extended family along her daily route and her mental map. Displays also the family kinship relations and landmarks. The sister's home, uncle's entrance, the brother's cap stop. In general, in almost all of our mental maps, one could see a similar pattern focusing on the kinship in mapping the personal city, especially for newcomers in Shushi who were completely new and were breathing a life into the city through them. In recognizing the city, the birth of their kids and their early years are emphasized by the famous idea of the circle. Everything starts through walking for the city and creating as a way of creating the urban space. In the event of Shushi, this is materialized in the literally first steps that the toddlers born there were taking. It's remarkable that those who have left the traces of their first steps in Shushi, those who were born there, are reserved the right to return to Shushi one day and breathe life in it one day. This is a sense of a mission. In the loss of the city, being the birthplace of one's own children, this also is important by throwbacks to the past cultural, historic significance of Shushi. One woman tells us Shushi is an ancient location replete with museums and historical sites. My kids were born there, they spent their childhood there, and in this respect, she juxtaposes Shushi even to Stepanakert. Even in the Artsakh overall context, Shushi is classified among small towns. As of 2017, Stepanakert had 56.6 thousand population. Shushi only had 5.3 thousand. But however small it was in territory and population, it has always had specific significance for us Armenians, beginning with the early 20th century. It was called the Little Caucasian Paris, Little Armenian Paris. These characteristics best describe the trading, artisanal and cultural center that Shushi was. This side of 90s, the Shushi restored its significance and the image of a pan-Armenian focus. The attention focused on it. People were performing their most personal rites, baptism, christening, weddings in Shushi. It became a pilgrimage site for Armenians, one may say so. As for native Shushi residents, it's very specific in the quote by this woman that her national, cultural, historical factors, alongside these, appear her children's birthplace as another major weighty factor. Shushi mothers and women's narratives best demonstrate, as Lynch says, their contribution to the readability of the city, and what an axis in it is the birth of the children. It's very characteristic. Uh, some of their ideas I have quoted here. And it's remarkable that they say this, they started to know the city only after the birth of their children. One woman who settled there in the 90s said, I started to understand and feel Shushi only after the birth of my child, who is only 6 now. She says today, I recall more the Shushi of my kid, the playground where we played every day, the toy shop that for him was an ideal fairy tale place. We can't find anything to replace it, not even in Stepanakert, not even in Yerevan, and nowhere else in the world. Rather than recalling her daily route that cut through the city. This city, feeling it, the trend of feeling it through one's own offspring more often than not turned into identifying the town with one's own kids. This is expressed by gauging the age of the city similar to the age of the children. I loved Shushi like my kids. It appeared in my life after birth of my children. We resettled and my kids were born. In some other case, you take care of the city like you would for your kids. Shushi is like my kids for me. It emerged in my life only once they were born, and we took care of it like we did for our kids. So they put the city up back on their feet together with their kids. The newcomers with newly formed families prevailing among them. This was very important in the familial perception of the city. They put back Shushi on its feet, caring for it, or as one of the respondents typically described, we were putting it together morsel by morsel in the 90s. What she meant is that in their courtyards, basements, attics, whenever they found something, a piece of rock or a piece of wood or pottery, they thought it may have had historical significance. They collected it all carefully and handed it over to the museum, restoring the Armenian history of Shushi, which within the last century had been interrupted more than once, once trying to complete and put back this history together. And here I would like to emphasize that in this respect, the dwellers of Shushi were particularly involved in building the city, in designing, one may say it, in creating it. The fact that in the West, in the 70s of the 20th century, especially the human dimension of the city were emphasized in the urbanistic theories, emphasizing the involvement of the citizens, of the dwellers in the design, in the development of the cities. This happened in Shushi in and of itself, sporadically, spontaneously. The citizens of the city were involved in creating, building the city themselves. And this quote is also very characteristic in that if They were resembling the city to their kids. Once it's lost, it becomes an infant, the most helpless and unprotected creature that they try to keep, preserve, and make safe through their thoughts. These two motives I wanted to emphasize in attaching significance to the city. We see how concurrently, in parallel, the city child, the household nature of the city is ascribed importance to in one case, and in the other, its historical past. This photograph that was taken is one of the most circulated ones closer to the end of the Artsakh War. It is entitled "The Smiling Children of Shushi." Best captures and visualizes the so important axis emphasized in the narratives of Shushi, the familial aspects and the historic nature. They're on the background of the Ghazan Chetsot's cathedral as a cultural historical symbol, and the kids are not just friends, they're siblings. Two siblings with their cousin. This attitude of the city, putting it together morsel by morsel, subsequently has led to the personal perception of the entire space of the city, all public spaces. For example, they're shaken when they present how the Armenian authorities have once visited on occasion of some celebration the main square, where they usually organized all such festivities. For the first time, access was shut off to the main square and the people did not have access. They presented this as something out of the ordinary that had never happened before, and the same attitude prevailed towards numerous educational cultural establishments of Shushi. They were perceived as some extension of one's house with free access, where youngsters and kids were involved, not like they're done in the other cities based on their preferences or talent, but everyone is simply an integral part of those establishments. Narekatsi Arts Union, Music School, Athletic School, they were all part and parcel of their lives. And in conclusion, if I attempt to say what made this city the way it was, one may safely claim that first and foremost it was of the small scale of it and its pedestrian nature. Of course, in Shushi there was just one public transport route, but people were mostly walking around. They preferred that, and it contributed both to the readability and sporadic improvisational nature of the town, if we use the terminology of Deserto. By walking through the city, they, rather than following the spatial patterns, they chose themselves alternative shortcuts, scenic routes. In the mental maps, you can encounter shortcuts, scenic routes. One of the youngest respondents, a 13-year-old girl, said that she, together with her friends walking to school every day, preferred the scenic route, which passed nearby the woods, which is why they preferred it. So their by daily movement through the city, they breathed life into the space and made the city live. And the second circumstance was the concurrent nature of creating a family and the city. Like I said, the demographics of Shushi determined that. And this also determined the third factor. There were no extended social kinship relations that we're well aware of elsewhere. More often than not, these were replaced by neighborly links, educational, cultural institution established links, work relations, especially about neighborly relations. People recall these with particular warmth, and in their mental maps, they particularly flag the houses of neighbors and with captioning them with their names. The neighbors seem to be replacing the extended families, grandparents that you could leave the kids safely with and go to work, you name it. And in the event of one Shushi woman, Granny Julia, she seemed to have been the grandmother of all Shushetsis. She was nurse in the hospital, then a cook. She died right in the wake of displacement because of coronavirus. And if we look at the Facebook entries and posts after her death, everyone was unanimous in recalling the meals she cooked, the good care they took of everyone in the hospital. She was the quintessential granny figure of for all Shushi people. Since we have a little more time left in the event of Shushi, the connection to the locus ascribes importance not as much to one's home as to the town itself. The basis of connection to the locus is deemed to be the home, but not in the event of Shushi. When in the 90s they settled in Shushi, they preferred not to choose the houses formerly occupied by Azeris. They were avoiding this. Many did not put up with the Azeri past of those houses, which cannot be claimed about the city as a whole, although it was a divided city beginning with middle of the 19th century with its upper Armenian and lower Turkic belonging, but its overall appertainance did not pose any questions for the Shushetsis. It's an often encountered idea. Even if my house is completely razed to the ground, I would like to return back and rebuild it, go back to my Shushi. Thank you for your attention.